Hey, welcome back to the Progressive Brothers Podcast. This is episode 41. I'm here with my co-host, Renaissance Man.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. Please like the video, share, and subscribe if you're not to the channel. And peace to everyone in the chat.
Also follow us on Twitter at brothers_podcast. So, interesting events, turn of events that has happened the last few days with protests happening at the Capitol. You had the Brothers Day of Action, which is a conglomerate of black men coming together from different civic organizations and different bodies of nonprofit organizations, looking to protest and demonstrate, peacefully demonstrate the Voting Rights Act or the voting rights restrictions that's happening all over the country. And these brothers were arrested. Now, I find this to be very interesting because peacefully demonstrating gets you arrested, but, damaging Capitol Hill on January 6th doesn't get you arrested. What's your thoughts on this, Renaissance man?
Yeah, interesting dynamic. Obviously look at the history of this. Looks like it was sort of an organized practice of civil disobedience, but it does go to show the craziness of America. That you've got a small group of people protesting voting rights, and you have people who are literally trying to stop the democratic process from proceeding with the aid of the president. And you're just getting some of those people arrested, and some of them that are getting charged are getting off very lightly with, probation or, credit for time served, where they spent some time in jail awaiting trial. So it just shows the dichotomy of America of, hey, like I said, people can be upset with the political process, and you got people kind of saying, let's just forget about that and move on when they try to storm the Capitol. And here you have even lawmakers along with activists and people from the press who were out there protesting just for the protection of basic rights and upholding the Constitution.
Yeah. And so I want to read the 15th Amendment because I think it's important that people understand what these brothers were actually protesting about. And so this is from our documents.gov. To former abolitionists and to the radical Republicans in Congress who fashioned Reconstruction after the Civil War. The 15th Amendment, enacted in 1870, appeared to signify the fulfillment of all promises to African Americans. Set free by the 13th Amendment, with citizenship guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, black males were given the vote by the 15th Amendment. From that point on, the freedmen were generally expected to fend for themselves. In retrospect, it can be seen that the 15th Amendment was in reality only the beginning of a struggle for equality that would continue for more than a century before African Americans could begin to participate fully in American public and civic life. African Americans exercised the franchise and held office in many southern states through the 1870s, but in the early 1890s, steps were taken to ensure subsequent white supremacy literacy tests for the vote, grandfather clauses excluding from the franchise all whose ancestors had not voted in the 1860s, and other devices to disenfranchise African Americans were written into the Constitution of former Confederate states. Social and economic segregation were added to Black America's loss of political power. In 1896, the Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, legalized separate but equal facilities for the races. For more than 50 years, the overwhelming majority of African American citizens were reduced to second-class citizenship under the Jim Crow segregation system. During that time, African Americans sought to secure their rights and improve their position through organizations such as the NAACP and National Urban League, and through the individual efforts of reformers like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and A. Philip Randolph. The most direct attack on the problem of African American disenfranchisement came in 1965, prompted by reports of continuing discriminatory voting practices in many southern states. President Lyndon Baines Johnson, himself a Southerner, urged Congress on March 15, 1965 to pass legislation which will make it impossible to thwart the 15th Amendment. He reminded Congress it is government of and by all the people. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, extended in 1970, 1975, and 1982, abolished all remaining deterrents to exercise the franchise and authorize federal supervision of voter registration where necessary. So this is interesting because many of these southern states that are pushing for legislation to have these voter restrictions in place are also former Confederate states.
Yeah. It's ironic because if you look back kind of at the history, when you start looking at all of the attacks on voting rights historically, post-slavery going into Reconstruction, you had a large black population. Obviously, that showed in Reconstruction, where you had places like South Carolina that had black senators, just because of the demographics. And post Reconstruction, you saw a real clampdown because of just the sheer size and number of population. And what you're seeing now, you have someone like Charles Blow, who we've discussed before in his book, Real Black Power. We advocates this reverse migration back to the South. You're sort of seeing that even people not adhering to his book, but just people in general, older people who have worked up north and looking at the retiring, they're moving back south, as well as, people who just want warmer weather, or, the Northeast and the West have just gotten too expensive. So I think part of what you're seeing with the onslaught right now is because they saw what happened in Georgia, where, Joe Biden carried the state, first Democrat to carry the state, I believe, in almost like 30, 40 years, something along those lines. And, he did it with less than 30% of the white vote. It really was just a testament to black voter engagement, black voter turnout, and then the fact that you did it 2 times in a row. You won the state, and you were able to mobilize people to then turn around and come out and vote again and win the runoff and get Warnock in office, Ossoff in office. And as you get closer to 2022, you've got someone like Stacey Abrams who's going to run for governor. Warnock's going to be up for re-election. You're looking at the possibility of a black governor, which the first, I believe that would be the first black governor since Reconstruction if she won in a state. So I think that's obviously why you're seeing this onslaught, and that's why you're seeing Republicans kind of freaking out in the sense, because if these population trends continue, it's only going to give more power to the African American vote, as long as making the assumption that people continue to vote in a block like we have done historically. So it's just an interesting dynamic right now. And the other thing, kind of tying back to the whole protest, another angle this is being attacked is, we'll see how effective it is, but Merrick Garland and the Justice Department basically are looking at another way of trying to protect the right to vote in these states where obviously Republican legislatures are trying to curb this. We're basically filing lawsuits, so we'll see where that goes. But it's only going to be something that's more contentious. I don't think this will be the last protest we see. I think it's going to be something that's going to continue to be an issue, obviously going into 2022, 2024 for re-election. But honestly, I could see it definitely being the sort of the fight of this decade, really, because the demographics are only going to work against Republicans, and I think they're just going to become more bold with this stuff.
Yeah, I just want to read one excerpt as well from Section 2 of the 15th Amendment. It basically says that the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Where is Congress on this right now? I mean, it's already been ratified. How can the state determine the capabilities of the 15th Amendment for certain citizens and not face a penalty for this? I would assume that if the restrictions going into play, if the bills are passed and the restrictions are going into play, I would assume that you can cut off federal aid to any of these states that decide to engage in voter restriction.
Yeah, I don't know the technical details, only because I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the technical area of the law. But I think this also goes back to Shelby versus Holder and parts of the Voting Rights Act being struck down in 2013, and people really not understanding the implications around that, or if they did, not being able to mobilize, because this is something that voting rights have always, really since Obama's election, voter rights and voting fraud and all these other accusations thrown around have always been something that's sort of an issue. But 2020, like I said, really amplified that when you saw, and I think it really hit home for Republicans. It's one thing to talk about demographic changes. It's another thing to actually see those manifest themselves, and you start losing states that you haven't lost in decades. That's where it really started to manifest itself. But, that decision in 2013 really put a death nail into the Voting Rights Act. And I believe they had another decision recently that was, another blow to it, where essentially you're having to have sort of federal legislation come back and be renewed to sort of put some teeth back into the law, just because it's been eroded so much over time with really 2013 with the whole pre-clearance, because that would have really stopped all this, what you're seeing. Because essentially what pre-clearance did is in states that essentially had a history of voter discrimination, any sort of changes to the voting laws had to be run through basically I don't know what body, but it was basically a federal body to ensure that this was not being done in a discriminatory manner. So you want to do things like change voting hours, expand any sort of major changes like that. They had to go through pre-clearance. With 2013, with that being struck down, that's where you're seeing these states who clearly have a history, because the ironic thing about pre-clearance is if your state had a demonstrated history of over a certain period of time of not engaging essentially in practices that boil down to discriminatory behavior, you would have been removed from pre-clearance anyway. So these states had a demonstrated history, and when that was struck down, it opened the door to what you're seeing right now.
Yeah, definitely. And what's going to be interesting that comes out of all of this, and based on what we're seeing, the Brothers Day of Action, is that they got arrested. It wasn't like they were destroying anything. It wasn't like they was yelling any obscenities. They were arrested for protesting a constitutional right to vote. And they didn't have any guns. These were sitting politicians. These were organized, nonprofit founders and other civic organization members who were basically standing in front of a podium and doing a demonstration. Whereas on January 6th, you had people who came in with nooses, gallows, weapons, bear spray, Confederate flags, body armor, zip ties, and beat law enforcement almost half to death. They almost bludgeoned these people to death. And the reaction is that they were peacefully demonstrating. If that's peacefully demonstrating, man, I don't know what to say at this point. Our language, the English language is being, hijacked for other reasons. What do you think about, the peaceful protesters being arrested versus violent demonstrators being allowed to go home and catch a flight?
Catch a flight. No. I think you hit it on the head. Like you said, these were high-profile people out there. You had, Al Green. You had Cliff Albright, who's the founder of Black Voters Matter. You had Hank Johnson. You had some very high-profile people out there. So it wasn't like, hey, even if these people did do something wrong, you had them on tape. You know who they were. It wasn't like, even if you did, it's like, okay, we have a film and we know who these people are. We can just identify them by looking at them. Yet they get arrested. Yet you have all these people who you can't identify, don't know who they are, literally committing, pretty much an insurrection on the Capitol, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember anyone being arrested that day. I believe it was mainly, hey, everyone went home, and it was kind of like, okay, we may have figured out some people because he saw the video of the guy trying to get on the flight, and he had been put on the no-fly list, so they had some idea who people were, you know, a little bit post afterwards. But I don't recall anyone being arrested that day. I remember it was more of, hey, you know, we got to take back control, sort of figure out what's going on, and then, you know, everyone basically who has video, hey, start trying to identify people if you can, and we'll catch up from there.
Yeah, I can't recall anybody who was majorly arrested on the spot. Maybe somebody got arrested after they left, but the fact that they were able to leave, to me, speaks volumes about, it was only 6 months ago. It wasn't like it was like 25 years ago that, you know, that these guys did this. No, it was only 6 months ago. You're talking 180 days, you know, from the day that it happened. And the outrage was that, you know, these guys who stormed the Capitol should not have been arrested. For whatever reason, they feel that these people had a right to go up there and be disruptive to the political process of certifying the electoral vote.
Yeah, you still have people who they still haven't caught. They're still trying to arrest people. If I believe, like a month ago, they were trying to say, okay, we've arrested this many people. Here's 100 more people we need to identify. So I think they're still trying to charge people.
Yeah. I mean, they were allowed to leave. I mean, of course, you're going to still have a problem trying to find people because you allowed them to go home. Whereas black men who were peacefully demonstrating, the most visceral thing that they had was their T-shirts. The T-shirts and their chant. That was about it. They didn't say "Death to America." They didn't say, you know, hang Kamala, like these other guys said they were going to hang Pence and all these other people. They wasn't looking for Nancy Pelosi. They were standing in front of a podium, permitted to demonstrate, and were arrested within minutes. Not, you know, days, but within minutes they were arrested. And I find it interesting that no one really wants to make that comparison to January 6th. No one wants to make the comparison to what happened in Michigan with the governor and the lieutenant governor and some of the congressional bodies that were there. Although those guys got arrested later after the fact, they came up there with guns, right? If I remember correctly, most of your state houses are forbid firearms on premise. From what I know, that's what it is. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that you have a lot of people who justify January 6th, but will turn a deaf ear and a blind eye to, you know, these brothers being arrested the other day, only a few days ago. No one's talking about this. I haven't seen anyone in social media outside of Roland Martin and maybe BNC talking about this, you know, in the fashion that would really make that direct comparison.
Yeah, and I think also the fact that black men were able to organize, I think this also is another thing that flies in the face of a narrative, at least we hear in this space, of you have some guys who say, hey, we've organized before and we got nothing. You have some guys who literally think, okay, what's the point of organizing? And you have some people who say, you know, the women are kind of running things and there's no room for the men. You know, this whole, what you just saw, this disproves it. You know, imagine if they had, obviously it could have been a lot more arrests, but, you know, imagine if they had more black men out there. You know, you had a second coming of the Million Man March almost, you know, equivalent of that. You know, how powerful that would have been for, you know, sending a message about voting rights and raising awareness about the issue. So I think it's key that that's highlighted, that, you know, this is where organizing can be effective. And you can really send a message when you have more people out there. And I guess technically, you know, it could have also worked the opposite. Maybe they felt they could arrest these people because it was a lot fewer and it was easier to control versus, you know, you had a whole crowd of people like that. It would have been like, okay, we don't want to, you know, create a situation that becomes hostile. So we'll just, you know, let people be and kind of let it die down itself, assuming that, you didn't get sort of a code red and, have massive police presence like you should have prior to January 6th.
But what would be the justification for arresting them anyways? They weren't breaking any laws. They weren't even inside the Capitol. Keep that in mind. They weren't inside the Capitol. They were outside the Capitol.
Now, you wouldn't have, like I said, it would have been treated differently. I always feel like when you're dealing with the law, that when push comes to shove, be it police or even, just overall laws in general, that when people really want to look for something to try to arrest you on, or at least, give you a citation or something, and then say, oh, you're being disorderly or something like that, that's what they'll look for. I could definitely see, you have a large group or even a small group, and you can claim, oh, this is disorderly conduct. And then, if these people refuse to follow instructions, we have a justification to arrest them.
Interesting, because like you mentioned earlier, that, this dispels the myth of black men can't organize. And in fact, they did organize pretty well, and peacefully organize. From what I've seen, black men organizing, generally the last year and a half since George Floyd have been rather peaceful. You've had other black men in Black Lives Matter who have peacefully demonstrated, and look at the resistance that was put up against them. The Trump administration used Department of Homeland Security, Customs, Border, and Protection in Seattle to actually engage Black Lives Matter. A lot of people don't know this. And they were able to use and utilize drones against Black Lives Matter based on the fact that in Minneapolis and Seattle, they were within the restricted area or the jurisdiction of Customs, Border, and Protection. So for people who don't know, the distance that Customs and Border Protection have to engage in their ability to police duties, so to speak, anywhere from a U.S. border, whether it's the land, sea, or air, they have 100 miles square miles. Is it square miles? I think it's 100 miles that they have from the border to the interior of any state to actually intercede in any sort of activity on the ground. And so what Trump did was he used drones in Minneapolis from the Canadian border over Black Lives Matter protests and demonstrations. He also used it in Seattle to engage law enforcement, CBP, Customs Border Protection, against peaceful demonstrators. So when you see, a lot of, federal agents and cladded in armor and whatnot, that was DHS. That's what the President of the United States used last year against peaceful demonstrators, whereas on January 6th, they were nowhere to be found. But when it comes to these brothers peacefully organizing in front of a podium, within minutes they are arrested.
Yeah, the other thing I think you have to put in context too is I think it's safe to say the people who were out there protesting on January 6th were part of the far right. When you look at these brothers, they're going to be, I'm sure some of them are going to be some more of a little bit more to the center, but center left really is what you're talking about, who is out there. And just when you look at data, it is well known just from data alone that the far right is responsible, hands down, for a lot more violence in the last 25 years and just overall than the far left in this country. So it's kind of ironic too, in the sense of, once again, the far right is out there on January 6th. The far right is out there, with the Proud Boys coming to DC, going through the streets, pulling knives and starting fights and stuff. People aren't really getting arrested, but, a peaceful protest breaks out and, people are getting arrested, and people drew that same parallel with January 6th and George Floyd protests last summer, a little bit over a year ago, around this time, where people literally did side by sides of when you look at the force of those people versus look at the force of when a Black Lives Matter protest was going on. The force, guys out there and riot gear and mask and batons, all of that, as well as pepper spray, pretty much out there going for a battle, armored vehicles type with people popping out. And, you compare that to January 6th.
Yeah. Final statement is basically, when it comes to civil rights and constitutional rights, this country still fails to uphold those amendments and those civil rights for Black men in this country in ways that is really interesting, to say the least, because it's not like people were being violent at all. I mean, the idea was that BLM was just a violent movement and they were burning things down. Well, how do you explain these brothers being arrested over the weekend? How do you explain sitting politicians being arrested, but people with zip ties jumping over seats inside the Capitol, somehow they're not arrested, and guys taking laptops, people taking laptops, trying to sell it online, trying to look for Nancy Pelosi, looking for sitting politicians, going after Eugene, who is now the sergeant in arms at the Capitol, threatening him, calling him, all types of obscenities. And yet these people were only arrested months later. Black men arrested immediately. What's your thoughts? Final thoughts.
Yeah. Once again, like I said, it shows the two Americas, as you could say, as far as just the perception of people, how people are treated, the things that people have to go protest for. Once again, you're protesting about something that, truth be told, should be covered under the Constitution. We've been protesting this, for years at a time. Previously, the Voting Rights Act and its renewal was really a nonpartisan issue. If you'll remember, I believe it was during, I think it was Bush's first term, maybe a second one, beginning of a second one. You had a renewal of the Voting Rights Act. So, I mean, voting rights has historically been something that's bipartisan. It's kind of been a formality, and now it's sort of shifted into this partisan issue of people throwing out all sorts of claims about voter fraud and people voting twice and people being purged from rolls. All of this, it's pretty obvious if you follow the history of it, what's going on. But it's just ironic in the sense of you have one group who's literally down there protesting the right to vote, and you have another group that's down there protesting because they didn't like the outcome of the right to vote and felt that it should be overturned or changed because they didn't like the outcome. So it just shows the two Americas, the sort of perceived grievance of one group and then the real grievance of another group. And yet, ironically, how those two groups are treated, and ironically backwards in a sense, because I mean, you should argue that, hey, the people who are down there protesting voting rights, like which happened last week, are basically people who are, like I said, protesting things that should be secured under the Constitution. Those people should be handled with the kid gloves, and the people who are down there protesting to try to disrupt the voting process, and transition of power, those are the people you need to be aggressive and go and arrest. But once again, it's opposite, and the shoe's kind of on the wrong foot in the situation, and it's not good from an optics situation, in my opinion.
Not when you're trying to promote democracy in other countries.
Oh yeah, absolutely not. Or trying, the truth be told, restore the legitimacy of ours. Because I mean, I was looking at a document this week where it was talking about essentially, it's a black eye. If you look at what happened on January 6th, and what's going on in the state legislatures, and someone like Trump essentially trying to find a way to not transition power, all those things are things that happen in countries that are shifting towards authoritarianism. Definitely shouldn't be happening in liberal democracy. And like I said, trying to restore just those basic pillars that have been eroded over the past few years. And this is the response. Like I said, it doesn't look good. And that's why democracies across the world are kind of seeing some of their legitimacy being chipped away, and authoritarianism has been trending.
Democracy dies in the dark. Like, share, and subscribe.